Do you feel burned out from using social media as your main tool to grow your podcast and have conversations with your listeners? But do you wish that there was a tool that could help you create more content faster and that required less hands-on, being on less times? Well, let me tell you that there is, and is almost like a tale as old as time, and that is email marketing. Email marketing is one of those tools that you can have to promote your podcast, to increase your chances of monetization. And yes, it does help you grow your podcast. Now, a lot of podcasters overthink what email marketing needs to be. There's also a lot of misconceptions around what is a good newsletter and what is the best way to use it, especially if you're someone who has, squirrel brain and has a lot of passions, but gets overwhelmed really easily. Now, the strategies that I'm going to be talking about in this podcast episode, I have tested not only for my brand, The Podcast Space, but also for clients that have been saying for years, I want to start a newsletter. I know that I'm supposed to have one, but I can't find the best way to approach it because I feel like I just have empty page syndrome. So this podcast episode is going to help you unlock those issues that you've been having with email marketing. And I'm going to be sharing the one tool that you can have to create better podcast newsletters effortlessly. If we haven't met, hi, I'm Xavier. I'm the founder of The Podcast Space. And through my company and this podcast, I help impact-driven entrepreneurs nurture their communities, grow their brand online without overwhelming, without burnout. So let's dive into this episode. Did you know that email marketing has one of the best return on investment? If you were to spend $1 on your newsletter, you are likely to get a return of $36. That's a 3,600% ROI. So it's wild. And what is interesting is that email marketing has been here since forever, right? It's one of the oldest tools that marketers use to grow the business, to get sales, to connect with audiences. Yet I find that a lot of the content that has been created is a lot for business owners and for neurotypical creators. So people who love structure, who love going into, A, B, C, D, and then eventually get to Z. Whereas I feel that the clients that I serve, the podcasters that I work with, they have so much creativity bubbling all the time, yet it's really hard for them to write newsletters. And trust me, I used to be one of those people as well. And actually, that's when I found one of my 5 formats that I developed to help podcasters just start and sustain a newsletter so that eventually they become comfortable enough that they can create content without burning out, that gets emails open, gets them downloads, and even gets them in front of potential sponsors who are willing to invest on their podcast through sponsorships, brand partnerships, or simply by help them understand how to better market their services to their community. So let's dive into what are some of these formats. I want to talk to you about what you think a newsletter is. There are some creators that can write extensively. There are some newsletters, they are incredibly complex and well designed. But for podcasters, we get stuck into this perfectionism mode and we think that we have to write really well. This content needs to be new. And that's one of the main misconceptions about email marketing is that the people that already know you, they're going to be on your newsletter. And that's not true at all. I have people who have followed my podcast for years, who have been on my social media for years, even longer. And then there's people that have never joined my newsletter or that joined my newsletter fairly recently. And so when we don't have a newsletter, and I had this situation happen, I was at a conference and I was talking to a brand. And what happened was I was telling them, I'm looking for sponsors for my podcast. I've been creating content for years. I launched my company in 2020. I have experience with podcasters from all over the world. And this is the type of client that I serve. And so they were like, oh my gosh, that sounds such a great alignment. But do you have a newsletter? Because we're more keen on sponsoring podcasters who have a newsletter because we can track it better. And I have talked about it on the podcast before. Return on investment for podcasting can be a little tricky for brands because they're used to having pixels, having promo codes, having ways to track that traffic. And with podcasting, it can take a while longer. Think about how when you're listening to a podcast, sometimes you hear about a promo code, but when you're doing something else because you're multitasking, when you're listening to a show, you may forget to go and check that thing out, right? But when we're on our email, we have a clean access point from A to point B. And so that is one of the reasons why brands really like email marketing, because they can track and it's easier path. And for a lot of users, they still feel like whatever is arriving on their inbox is more trustworthy than what they see, for instance, on a social media post. And so what is interesting is that just like podcasts, you don't need a huge newsletter size to have impact, right? To sell things, to connect to your listeners, to receive emails. It's all about that creation of that intimacy and that relationship with subscribers and listeners. And so realizing that not everyone who is listening to your podcast will have a newsletter, and especially if you're like me who has a website and who has organic traffic, they may visit and they may want to sign up to get resources, but they may not realize that I have a podcast, or they may just be happy with the podcast that they are listening to already. So having an email newsletter, it's helping reach the community where they're at. And especially as business owners, we feel like our time is so fragmented that feels like when we're looking at social media, we often feel as business owners, as podcasters, that we're creating content, but only about 1 to 4% of our audience actually gets to see our content, which can be super frustrating, especially if our time is very valuable and we are, just trying to be strategic about where you're investing your time by looking at the data, by looking at your reach, at your numbers. Like, we're actually making progress and we're not just, doing busy work. And there's no algorithm. There's no kind of like gatekeeper between you and your audience when you have an email newsletter. So all of the things that I teach you on this podcast episode are about reframing your expectation of what you need to create and the output. And so something else that I think that a lot of podcast hosts struggle with is just being top of mind. There's a lot of noise on social media. There's a lot of noise on feeds. We know that the majority of podcast listeners will consume a podcast episode within the first 24 hours. So what if you were to look at this newsletter as more of a nudge, another way to tell your listeners, hey, like there's this fun nugget that I included on my newsletter, or then there's like exclusive behind the scenes content that I discussed on my newsletter that is kind of more relaxed and can be kind of tailored to that audience, that you could have, for instance, if you have an assistant or a podcast producer, they could have additional content created by them that you personally don't need to create. That starts creating this appeal to join something exclusive without overthinking what it could be, right? It gives you some freedom. And so when we're thinking what can be considered as good content for a newsletter, you first need to decide within your strengths, what is stuff that you're happy with creating, or what is a format that you think that you could consistently create. And I hear this from podcasters all the time. I know I could do this. I just need more time. Or I know I can do this. I just need to get myself in the right mindset. And what I find when I'm coaching clients is that, yes, we can do all these things. But what James Clear says in Atomic Habits is trying to make those better decisions more accessible and less friction between you and what you need to do, right? So let's say if you want to start eating better, but when you're looking at your pantry or your fridge, all you have are like things there you have to prepare, or that you have to put a little bit of time, or maybe they're not as accessible. What's going to happen is that you're going to go into maybe the prepackaged foods, the ones that are not as healthy, kind of going against what your goal is, which is to eat better. And so it's the same thing for podcast newsletters, because you think that you have to start from scratch, or you're looking at what maybe a creator with a whole team has, and like you're just thinking like, I don't have the capacity to do. These 5 formats that I've created have really helped podcasters start creating and sustaining a newsletter that gets them to a point that then they say, okay, you know what? I'm confident, I've been consistent, and we know that as creators, as consumers of content ourselves, we do value someone who's there all the time, right? So if you create a great newsletter, but you send a newsletter today, and maybe in 2 weeks, and maybe within a month, and maybe you don't send a newsletter for like 3 months, it's not going to create that trust with our audience. And so what if we scale back and try to find these formats that I found, and that helps you create time and systems to then build that confidence to start writing newsletters, maybe in a more complex matter, or maybe that's it. That's all you send. I like creating content that is like high effort and lower effort. And it's not like no effort or like bare minimum. We're talking about MVP content, basically the minimum viable product they can create that is valuable for our listeners or our potential subscribers if they're not on our podcast list yet. And so what is really interesting is that I have talked to podcast hosts that have been building these email lists because they just have those forms in multiple places on the website or the show notes, or they talked about it on the podcast, hoping that one day they will find the inspiration to strike. And then one day they have that, kind of direct download from the universe and they start writing prolifically and they just find the right format. Let me say, 90% of clients that I work with have started and sustained a newsletter because we found a format that worked with their habits. And so I want you to think about kind of three things. What are people always asking you about? What content are you already creating? And third is really thinking about where do you want to be? And so the first is really thinking about what's the behind the scenes that you can create for these audiences that already are interested in what you do. And overthinking this is going to mean that you think you have to write a lot, but when you're pulling back and thinking, okay, what are some data points that I'm already seeing that could indicate what people want to hear from me? So that's one of the formats that I break down in my strategy. So that's looking at your social media and repurposing some content that you've already created, that you had engagement with your listeners. So you say, okay, people have consistently respond well to X. So thinking about how can you incorporate more of that in your email newsletters? And again, reminding you, just people who follow on social media and people who subscribe to your newsletter and people who listen to your show are not always the same, right? Another format that is probably where you're going to be hearing about talked a lot is the show notes summary or the episode show notes summary. There's a couple of different ways to do it. The model that I see done very poorly is where you basically use the whole show notes, and the show notes are very vague, or they're all based on the bio of the guest if you are an interview show, and they don't really create a lot of curiosity, and they don't also invite the subscriber to engage with it. It's kind of like, I'd say like lazy practices, and I normally say that lazy practices invite lazy behaviors. So if you don't put in the effort within the newsletter, then how can we expect for our subscribers to click play? And that's something that I see, especially when people put a lot of blocks of text. It's really hard, especially when you're on a mobile device. Think about that last time that you receive an email and it was like, my goodness, like super lengthy show notes. It was just super tiny text, not very appealing to the eye. Or then the images were just like basically not loading or loading weird. And so some of these formats do not work, right? But when I'm thinking about what it needs in order to create authenticity, I developed these show notes format that talks about how you can tease curiosity, and you can use those as ChatGPT prompts as well to help you write better show notes. And a lot of podcast platforms already have either built-in AI or even in your editing process that, like for instance, I use Descript and Riverside to record and edit my podcast. And so some of these tools already have really cool show notes built in. And so when we're writing, not having a framework to writing these show notes feels really overwhelming, and is just kind of like, it feels very inconsistent. And so that's one of the reasons why you may not feel compelled to read those show notes, because they have not been written in the best layout so that you don't feel compelled to just even scrolling. Another one that I do talk about is the kind of like the combination newsletter. And that's the one that I use the most in my business. And so I have been going through iterations of writing them myself, having copywriters write the show notes for me or for my clients when I had a production agency. And then also I have gone through the iteration of using AI to write better show notes. And throughout this, I've come to realize that the tools and the people that work for you are only as good as the input you give them. And so when we're thinking about writing like a combination email, the important thing is that you're connecting that combination to like your content buckets so that it stays connected. And when we're creating content, we have to think about it like, what's the one takeaway that I'm giving the audience to learn? Even though if they do not click play, how can I make this the most valuable information that they read today that acts both as like, oh wow, this was cool, plus a reminder to have them subscribe to the podcast. My newsletter, if you have not, make sure that you go onto the show notes. I do have a link. If you have not subscribed, please do. And so just like you, I go through phases in my business or life when I look and I say, wow, like this week is really busy, whether I had a lot of coaching clients or I had consulting work, or I don't know, I'm going to be out and about, or I have a friend that I want to meet. I want to make sure that I have this format that is more flexible. So some weeks I will write a newsletter that is super lengthy, that I'm just pouring my heart out. And other weeks, I'm going to be using a combination of some of these formats, like it's a social media caption, or maybe it's like an essay that I feel like writing, but the value is always there. I know that I don't necessarily get email replies from a specific format. It's more about like how the listener connects to that messaging. And I actually asked one of my coaching clients, I was like, hey, like when you started working together, what was one of the reasons why you decided to work with me? And her specific reason was your newsletter. You deliver a lot of value. And I'm like, awesome. So it was a reinforcement that yes, whatever I'm creating, whether that's a bit more lengthy or is more repurposed or whatever it is, it's still generating value. And you will run into moments where like, what do I talk about? But it's finding the tools and recognizing what can be something that you can talk about. And I started gathering some of those formats, some of the formats that I have used with clients. And the ultimate goal is, okay, if you want to do an MVP product one week and then a very thorough newsletter the following one, it's totally fine. But what are the things that are consistent? On my newsletter, you have kind of like the topic of the week, and then something that I promote, whether that's another creator, it's a piece of content that I talked about maybe like 6 months ago that my current audience may have missed, or they may not have subscribed to my newsletter at the time. And then a bunch of links or insights into podcast stats, podcast news, podcast events that they need to know about. And those I kind of built throughout the week, because if I see something, I'm like, oh, let me go, open the tab, slap that link there, off we go, we're good. So that is one of the ways that I find myself creating content in a way that feels easier for me. And I have been creating formats for clients based on kind of like how they behave or how they best operate, who they're best for, how long it takes to set it up. Also, how long does it take to be maintained? Because as podcasters, we know that like, look, I can find myself creating a 10-minute newsletter, but maybe not a 30-minute. And that's 10 minutes is one of the best ones that I have designed. And not only like what do we include, but also what newsletter tools you can use. I have recommended two, and it has some guides, and those two are the ones that are mostly used for creators. Some if you have a little more knowledge, and the other one is more about if you feel really overwhelmed with software, like that's kind of like an easier format, but also not just the pros and cons of each, but how do you design it so that you're enhancing your chances of people scrolling through that newsletter, clicking through to listen to the show, or hitting reply, right? You want to look at like, what are your goals with these podcasts? And when we're talking about like, where do you see yourself going? I really want you to think about, you're not going to be creating a newsletter consistency if you are having a lot of obstacles on your own way. It's harder to have a conversation with a brand about getting a sponsorship for your podcast and your newsletter when you don't have a newsletter going than if you've just been sending newsletters consistently to your email and having that conversation back and forth, right? And so what I like about this guide is that it's not just like one of those things that you read it once and that's it. It's an asset that you can come back to when you're like, I'm tired of this format. What else should I be creating? So, you'll have like the social media format, the show notes template. You'll have an RSS feed one. You'll have also like a combination. There's so many different formats to go through, and there's so many details that you will go, okay, got it. Yes, this is now perfect for the phase of the business I'm in. Or if I want to move looking forward, if I want to start incorporating some opportunities for sponsorships or features or whatever it is, it will include those best practices there. So I want you to think about what it would look like for you to start this newsletter right now. And so I invite you to visit the show notes for the link to the 5 quick and effective newsletter formats for busy podcasters that I've created. It includes all of my at least 5 years of experience working specifically with business owners who podcast, has the experience of all of my years in journalism and dissecting information, how to better market a topic, right? All the expertise that you need in order to start and sustain this newsletter that's going to help you stop wondering, will this be good enough? How can I start this newsletter? Because I want to get another tool to market my podcast. So if you want these 5 quick and effective newsletter formats for busy podcasters, you can look at the show notes. I will put the link right on the top so you can click right away. And I have a special pricing for the upcoming 2 weeks. So if you want to get it right now, I'm going to be increasing the price. I want to make sure that it's accessible for all podcasters. So you'll get the early bird discount. So you cannot have an excuse that, it's not affordable enough. Right now, it's going to be at $19 when the value of this newsletter is $99. And, when you're looking at it, you're going to be like, this girl's crazy for just charging $19 for this. So if you're ready to start a newsletter, if you're looking for monetization opportunities, if you're looking to increase your downloads, do not wait out another year, another 6 months, another 2 months to start a newsletter. And if you've listened to the show enough, you know that I'm all about being practical so that you can show up in a way that is exciting for you, that you can connect with your listeners without imposter syndrome, without fear of something not working, because listening to this podcast, you know that anything that I share here is valuable for you and your podcast and your business. So visit thepodcastspace.com and also the show notes here in this episode to get yours. I'll see you in the next episode.